welcome to tonight's Creative Sensemaker Live Thinking in partnership with Santander, in which we're going to ask a very simple question, which is, were the 90s simply better than now? I'm Matt Dancona. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and it is a real treat to welcome you all here tonight. And I think first, why are we posing the question? Well, two reasons, I guess. I think the 90s, being old enough to have lived through them and enjoyed them, were a bright, brash, colourful decade, about as far from the greyness of lockdown as it's possible to conceive. There was Euro 96, there was Britpop, there was the YBA artists, there was the Battle of the Bands, there was Trainspotting novel and movie, the Spice Girls, the silly but fun idea of called Britannia, and a general sense, justified or otherwise, that Britain was once again the creative hub in the world, which was much encouraged by the famous Vanity Fair cover of Liam Gallagher and Patsy Kensit in bed with a Union Jack duvet. So there's that. And second, which is a bit more specific, because there's suddenly a lot of 90s retro chic about, particularly Nick Moran's terrific film about Alan McGee and Creation Records, Creation Stories, which you can see on Sky, and I thoroughly recommend. The news that Bobby Gillespie of the mighty Primal Scream has been spending lockdown writing his memoirs, coming out later this year. The documentaries about Screamadelica resurfacing on streaming services and so on. And also a growing interest in 90s fashion and vinyl. So why is this going on? And that's what we're going to try and unpack tonight. So as ever, please do let us know what you think. The chat is being helmed by my colleague, 90s throwback Mark St. Andrew, has forgotten more about that decade than most of us will ever learn. So you are in safe hands. Just as a starter for 10 to get the dopamine going, let's get things off to start with a two-part poll. So can we put up the first part of the poll? There we go. So, was life better in the 90s? Yes, no, don't know. Okay, do it a little bit longer. It's hovering around, but interesting. Quite a strong showing for the 90s. Okay, so it finishes off with yes at a pretty high 56%, no 24%, and don't know at 19%. So the 90s roaring off to a good start of thinking, which is interesting. Can we have to see the second poll, please? If we can have the second poll up, that'd be great. Okay, which band do you prefer? Oasis, Blur, or Primal Scream? Or things are really a bit more. Again, it's settling on one, and there it is. I think probably, yep. Oasis, not quite such a big margin, 42%. Blur on 28%, and Primal Scream on 30%, which I'm sure would keep the smile on Bobby Gillespie's face. Funny enough, when I was a leader writer at the Times a million years ago, I actually had to write a leader about the Battle of the Bands, an editorial. So seriously was that taken, that moment when the two singles came out on the same day. That's how big a deal it was. And I think the Times came down, I know in fact the Times came down on the side of Blur, which displeased a great many people in the newsroom. So having done that, let me talk about the fantastic group of speakers we have tonight. We've got Sarah Blackwood and Chris Wilkie of the truly wondrous band Dubstar, who played us in, and with stars. And I was saying to them before, with this in a pathetically sort of fanboyish kind of way, that I can still remember the day back in 1995 when I went and bought their amazing debut album, Disgraceful, in HMV Canary Wharf, and I still have that CD, and I love it very much. And we have Robin Turner, who's for many years a legend at a legendary label, Heavenly Records, whose acts in the 90s included Saint-Étienne, the Manic Street Preachers, and that label's first single was produced by none other than the late, great DJ Andrew Weatherall, who those of you who are interested in Primal Scream will know produced the Mercury-winning sound of Screamadelica. And more to the point, Robin's own book, Believe in Magic, which I urge you to buy immediately, is required reading for anyone, not just who wants to understand that decade, but wants to understand the music and culture of our times. It's a really indispensable book. So thank you all, thank you to all of them for joining us. So let's start with Dubstar. Sarah and Chris. Let's start with Sarah. Just take us back to the 90s. You know, you're a Tyneside band coming down to London. What was there a difference in the music scene in Tyneside compared to the London that you entered? You know, as a really important act, one that was getting a lot of attention. What was the difference? And indeed, you know, how did it feel?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one to start with. I think when we were in Tyneside, we were sort of part of this very local, small scene. And then you came down to London and there's Blur. And there's like all these like massive bands. So yeah, it was quite daunting, I think. But we always felt like we could just get on the train and it was kind of door to door almost to Camden Town from Newcastle. It was really bizarre, but we had the benefit of being outsiders looking in for a little while. We were kind of the northerners in the south. Was
there a very strong? I mean, certainly, you know, in the Factory era, there was a very strong north-south divide. Was that similar in the 90s?
I think it was. Yeah, I think there was yeah, I think it was. Like Manchester bands were always very proudly Mancunian. You know, you had Oasis, you had the Stone Roses. It was a big sort of identity thing. And then you had like Welsh bands, you know, like the 60-Foot Dolls that were on the scene at the time. Yeah, and I felt like I have this imposter complex anyway, so I just felt like I was this outsider looking in, and everybody kind of belonged, and I didn't. so I was like felt naturally persecuted anyway. I was just.
And when we talk about scene, I mean, was there a? This, of course, it's important to remember, was pre-broadband. I mean, the internet existed, but social media, as we understand it now, didn't exist. So when you talk about a scene, you really were talking about people and places.
Yeah.
What were the main hangouts, and was there a sense of, you know, however many tensions there were between the different bands, was there a sense of camaraderie, in a sense that something exciting and collective was happening?
Yeah, it was palpable. It was in the air. I mean, the main hangout was the Good Mixer pub on that was in Camden Town, and but not. I didn't actually see that many bands in there. There was only kind of us and Menswear that used to really hang around in there, and sometimes Graham Coxon. But you know, it was. But I guess there was a sort of. It was a lot more competitive than camaraderie, I think.
Well, you mentioned, it's interesting you mentioned Graham Coxon, because you know you're on the same label as Blur, weren't you? Did they operate as a gang, or were they very much by that stage individual?
They were definitely individuals by then. Yeah, I mean, at the time, I mean, we'd see Graham around a lot because he was very much part of the Camden Town scene, which Food Records itself was, and that we were. But I think, like, you know, Dave the drummer was living up in Hampstead. Alex was in Covent Garden, I think.
It was Covent Garden, wasn't it?
Yeah, and
in the Groucho Club.
And David was more West London. So yeah, they only tended to get together. I mean, whenever I saw them together, it usually was at a Blur event of some kind. But I used to hang out with Graham sometimes at the Mixer, and there was a lot of people in the Mixer who were from bands. usually from bands that were trying to get going. They felt like they'd read about how some sort of magic was in the water there. So they figured, you know,
and like,
I mean, I think it upset Graham, because Graham used to like to go to those kind of pubs around Camden because he'd like to hang out with electricians and plumbers, and you know, because that's during the day that's who was in there. But when he used to get irritated by the bands, you know, it became, and also you'd have lots of Japanese tourists would turn up sometimes in busloads towards the end. I mean, when it first...
Saturday nights down there were just absolutely amazing, because it just used to spill out onto the streets. It was just insane, and everybody was just looking for Blur and Oasis. It was just nuts.
How would you characterize the sort of general mood of the time? I mean, was it as optimistic and colourful as a memory?
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, when we started the group in Newcastle in the early 90s, you know, we wanted to be, you know, we were kind of pitching ourselves as like a you know, One Dove or St. Etienne or something. You know, we had ideas about the kind of music that we wanted to make, which were kind of based on what was going on at the time in sort of like 1993 when I met Sarah and stuff. By the time we actually arrived in London in 1994, we were, you know, in the offices of Food. Parklife had just come out, and suddenly it really felt like what was already an exciting process of getting signed to a label and being able to make records. It went beyond that. You landed in the middle of a scene which had kind of exploded in front of you like the Conjurer's bouquet. You know, it's like there was a really clear, like as Sarah says, palpable sense that, you know, everybody's time had come. You know, it felt like we'd spent a lot of time hearing our parents' generation talking about how wonderful the 60s were, and suddenly it was our turn, because all of the signs were that actually it was. You know, it seemed that way.
What were the factors that had made that possible? You know, in the sense, if you look at, say, punk, it was very much a sense of DIY. You know, Joe Strummer saying, if you think you can do better, go out and make your own band. What were the kind of social factors that made what we call the 90s possible? What was different? What had changed?
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, the early 90s was quite a bleak time socially. Certainly up here, you know, we had the riots which were going on in Tyneside, which were largely, you know, a knock-on effect from the poll tax and things like that. It had been quite bleak. But at the same time, the bands at the time, you know, they seemed to be coming from London. I remember reading about, you know, the Good Mixer and what happened in Camden Town long before we got there by a couple of years. And then once we arrived, we realized that part of the reason why is because the script was being written by Savage and Best, which was the press office on Arlington Road next to Food Records. And they seemed to have the entire stable of the bands that I was reading about in the Melody Maker and the NME at the time. And so when it sort of when the rest of the country seemed to catch up, and the wider world, the fact that something exciting was happening musically, I think that the will to have something good happen became so great that it sort of breached in. And, you know, it usually takes a conflation of things to make something happen rather than one, you know, specific change. You know?
No, sure. And Sarah, was from the point of view of the sound and the style, did you ever feel there was a kind of distinctive 90s sound, or was the eclecticism that's often kind of talked about the point that you know, as on, say, Screamadelica, you know, it was bringing together a whole just a melange of influences and ideas and seeing what the hell happened?
I think it was a lot more eclectic than people actually sort of remember, because at the time I just remember it being a lot of bands trying to be like the 60s and pretending that the 80s hadn't happened, and we were just one of the bands that sort of admitted that the 80s had happened. So yeah, but then you look back and you realize just what the 90s did take in, and sort of especially like the early 90s. Yeah,
it was a very special time. Can I turn to Robin now? We'll come back to Sarah and Chris, of course. Robin, I mean, you know, in the book and in other interviews and so on, it's very clear that, I mean, you write that Heavenly it was more than, I think you used the phrase, it was more than just a label, it encapsulated a feeling. Can you kind of explain that?
Well, I mean, it was more than a label. Technically, it was more than a label because it was also a press office. Yeah. I started there in 1994 as a press officer. I got to know, but it was also a family, and still is. I don't work there anymore, but it's still as much of a family. I'm still sort of, you know,
rural associate.
Yeah, bastard child. But it's basically, it was kind of when I started there, I'd got to know them all through I'd got to know St Etienne through interviewing them for a fanzine, and then eventually I got to know all the Heavenly people, and I'd made records for St Etienne's label, and then I heard Res by Underworld, and just thought, I'm never going to make music again in my life. There's no point. I just gave up, and then I pursued Underworld to do their press, which is when I started at Heavenly. I started working for them. And so immediately, you know, you've got more than a label because you've also got the association of these other things. You've got Underworld. When I started working there, the Chemical Brothers, Dust Brothers as they were then, had just started being managed out of the office as well. So what we had what was, you know, a small independent label, but we also had a press office that was kind of slightly punching above its weight. We did Primal Scream, we did the unfortunate follow-up to Screamadelica, which I still rate as the best press job anyone's ever done, because somehow we managed to make sure that no one slagged it off, which was pretty remarkable because, I don't know, I mean, I've listened to it. So we did that, and then the Charlatans came to us, and we had this kind of extended family, which then became the club that we started, the Social, and so we had lots of different little bits, but it was all the same thing, really. You know, we didn't. So if you were in a band on Heavenly, then you were going to the Social, or you were possibly, you're going to go to, you're going to end up at an Underworld gig, or it kind of all melted, really. Everything was one and the same. It was brilliant. We it felt like it felt very. I don't know. I've never quite had that in any working environment since. I've never quite had this thing where you're working with mates and all the lines just blur.
You did describe yourself in the book in one of my favorite phrases that I've read in recent times is the office beds, which for those who know about the Happy Mondays, and I pity you if you don't, refers to the man who used to dance beside Shaun Ryder and give the Happy Mondays their kind of trademark rigor and discipline. What you describe is not just a company or a record label or even a club, but a milieu. That it was a place where people would go not just to sign things and promote things, but to actually listen till the small hours to music.
Yeah.
And I love the description that there was a great sort of Darwinianism of music in that if you could get people at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. as they started to fade to listen to a record, you knew you were onto a winner.
Yeah, we'd often have these, we'd often have sessions where we'd go back to the office after the pub, and I mean, so much of our work in the 90s was done in the pub to the point where the Ship on Wardle Street, the payphone at the back of it, you could ring the payphone, and quite often that was like the second office phone, and it was which meant you could never hide because everyone knew you were in the pub. But yeah, we'd often then pile back to the office, and it was a really good test of records. If you put something on and people wanted to hear it again, it was generally a sign that you had something pretty good going. I remember it happening with He's on the Phone by St Etienne. We just it was just played over and over and over again. We were all just there screaming "#1 forever," which, needless to say, it wasn't. And There Goes the Fear with Doves was a bit more of a successful one, slightly after the 90s. But we were playing that, and people would come round the office to hear it, because it was the only place. We had a CD of it, and you could come round and hear it. And that charted at #2 and was heralded a #1 album. It was a huge record, but it was part of the bravery of putting that record out as a 7-minute uneditable single was the test of having it in the office. And people go, well, everyone went for it. Everyone's going for it. People want to hear it. And you think, well, these aren't, we're not a weird microcosm of people here. We're pretty good reflection. So the office was a great barometer. I mean, for Heavenly, it still is. It's probably going on. I mean, lockdown aside, it's probably going on every Monday. It's always a Monday night every time. It's never any other night of the week. Just to really start your week really badly, you end up getting smashed in the office on a Monday.
It's certainly the logical night to do it on.
Exactly.
Did beyond the milieu, did it ever feel like a movement? I mean, we've heard a lot about the connection between, and indeed John Harris's book, The Last Party, is sort of all about this, about the connections between the music and the politics of the decade, which was, one of big change, and connections between the bands and New Labour. I mean, did it ever feel as if there was something going on that was more than just the music, or was it always really just the music?
No, I think, we were kind of, as much as we were a family, we were kind of away from the Britpop side of things, and we were, in the, I think the grounding of what we did was in electronic music a lot of the time. For me, certainly. And then when the club happened, that was very much it. And I think if you look at a sort of the John Harris version of events, brilliant book. But if you look at it that way, electronic music doesn't really get that much of a look in. It's it's not a huge part of it. Whereas, for us, it was, you watching bands like Underworld and the Chems just kind of grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and a very different kind of experience, something which was much more like an evolution of acid house, probably hedonistic to that, more so than guitar music. Politics was always a subconscious part of it, because I think, by the time we started the club, I think there was a real feeling, there was a sea change feeling from '94, I think, when that was, I really remember it feeling like, and Oasis rode that so spectacularly, I think. It felt, you knew something was going to change. The fact that it took 3 more years after that, it was so inevitable by then. And so politics kind of did seep into things, because I think it provided that optimism that Britpop rode on.
And did sport play a part in it too? I mean, Euro 96 just seemed to be part of it. It seemed to be the connective tissue between Euro 96 and all of the things we've been discussing seemed to be just very, very clear.
Yeah, I'm the worst person to ask about sport, because I can't kick a ball, throw, or anything. So I kind of, for me, I'm Welsh. It's all about the egg for me. So we, in terms of sport, it's, I think I naturally was a bit, I'd resist that whenever it happens. But of course it was huge, it was absolutely huge. That was 3 Lions, wasn't it? It was that year.
First 19 versions of 3 Lions that
you don't get that for rugby.
No, exactly. I wonder, thanks very much. We'll come back to you. I wonder if Ian Campbell's available. Ian, are you there? Hi, Ian. Nice to see you. You made a very interesting point in the chat about sociability, and I wondered, rather than me paraphrasing it, whether you could sort of expand on that and elaborate, because I think it was a very interesting observation.
Well, you put me on the spot here, but it's just such a long time ago now. But it was just such a sociable time for everyone, especially in Glasgow. There was like the kind of the house and club scene, and there was a big kind of renaissance and kind of literature with Trainspotting and Urban Welsh and a lot of authors, and it was that kind of pre-devolution era, and it just felt such a sociable time, and there was a real feeling that something was stirring in Scotland as well, I think.
And did you feel that that got fragmented once we all went on social media and sort of gathered in our old tribes? I mean, that sense of coming together that the 90s was undoubtedly about, and that many of the lyrics of its songs were about, somehow disappeared. And was that, and is that necessarily a bad thing?
I think it just came to a natural end. I just think that it was kind of around 97, I felt it just came to a natural end. I think it's fine to think of it back now, but I think the politics of it was quite important, and it just kind of came to an end once the politics changed. It didn't feel as needed, I don't think, and it just kind of faded away naturally. Just a kind of, I don't think it was anything to do with social media, because I don't think social media had really taken off at that time. I think it was just a natural change in the times and a change in the generation. I think just the generation of the early 90s, it was just a real rawness of culture and melting pot, and a change of the times. I just think it just kind of blew over, like. And
was that just a change in the mood of the Blair government, or 9/11, or something more general?
I think it was. I think the Blair government made a big difference to that. I think people felt that that times were changing, and that just the generations were changing, and people just didn't feel as the social. I can't explain why. The scene just the vibe just seemed to change towards the end of the decade, but there was a definite real kind of buzz in the air and in Scotland about the kind of music and literature and culture in the early 90s that most people that were around can definitely relate to. They weren't aware of it at the time, but it was a really big buzz. But it just kind of it came to an end kind of naturally about the late 90s. But during the time you lived through it, you look back on it, and it was a fantastic time to be going out, to be young and to be sociable. There was so much going on at the time in Glasgow anyway.
It's I think I'm sure you're right. I mean, culture changes like the weather, doesn't it? Thanks very much. Can I come now to Kirsty Loy, who I think is waiting?
Hello.
Hello, Kirsty. Hi. Sticking with Scotland, you said you made a point in the chat again, which I thought was very interesting, that it meant a great deal, the decade in Scotland. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so obviously with culture and literature, you've been speaking about train spotting. Like nowadays, everything is kind of like the in-betweeners. Everything's the female train spotting, the new train spotting. It's got train spotting's language. Everything is compared to that kind of time. And we had as well in 1994, we had James Kelman winning the Booker, and it was so rejected for using Scots language. But now in 2020, the Booker was won again by Douglas Stewart, again using Scots language. I think that from a cultural perspective, from a literature perspective, the 90s was really hot for Scotland, and it's now coming back again. The language, I noticed in 2020, was really popular in literature. So you had obviously Douglas Stewart, you had the Young Team, and so we kind of had a a return to that and an excitement about that again. And also obviously politically, there was the devolution, which is obviously a hot political topic with independence now. But I think that it was kind of a benchmark era for Scotland where so much was happening and it kind of died down, but we're coming back to it again now. So that's just something that I've noticed as a Scottish literature student, at least.
And do you what are your thoughts about it as a decade now? Do you see it as a better time, or just something through which Scotland passed and has now evolved?
I feel like I've kind of snuck in here. I was born in 1997, but for people like me, we think of, when we hear our parents speak about the 80s, we're like, yeah, the 80s were cool, whatever. But the 90s does feel like something a bit more aspirational. I don't know if that's because we had a tiny little snippet of it, but certainly because obviously politically there was a lot of movement. So it felt a little bit closer maybe to our politics. Culturally, there was a lot of movement that we could get involved in. Boys my age love Oasis. You can't get away from them. So yeah, I think that
they still love Oasis.
They love Oasis so much. You can't move for them. I prefer Pulp, but and 90s George Michael, but you can't move for 23-year-old boys that love Oasis.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. Can we go to Chris Stanlon now? I don't know if you're there, Chris. Chris,
hello?
Hi, how are you?
Hi there.
Hi, good to see you. Chris, you made a really interesting point about just the experience of growing up, in the village, as you put it, in the middle of nowhere, and this culture stretching out a hand to you. And I just wondered if you can say what you meant by that and how it felt.
I was 10 in 1990, so about 14, you discover the Manic Street Preachers, and it's like you find a whole thing of these people all on their own. Nothing's speaking to you. It's like really weird, and you've all frozen. Hello?
We're frozen.
It was like you felt like you weren't alone. It's like, I don't know how best to describe it. It was like, I wouldn't say being alienated, but it's like these people like My Little Planet, and it's like all these bands and all these cool stuff. You start to discover it when you start hitting the big cities, but you're so like, I'm the only one dressed in eyeliner and leopard print in a village in the middle of Scotland.
And do you look back on it now with fondness, with melancholy, or
a lot of fun stuff? Thank God social media didn't exist though. Yeah, it's, I don't know, social media would have, well, I don't know, it might have helped her that as a kid. You might have felt less alien, less, I don't want to say alienated, but you know what I mean? Like, these people, struggling here.
No, I know, but I think it's a very good point you make, Chris, which is that the sort of the big collective gatherings that happened in the 90s, the massive Oasis gigs and things. I'm sure that their equivalents will happen again, but the sense that there was something that everyone could share in has certainly been, let's say, challenged by social media, where we all live in our little digital tribes.
So yeah, I was like, 16 when I saw my first gig. It was the Manic Street Preachers at the SECC, and it was just a complete life changer. It was a massive experience because we were in a village 40-50 miles outside of Glasgow, and it was like, wow, this world exists.
Yeah.
Completely, everything changed, and I ended up spending a small fortune in Tower Records and Avalanche.
No, I think we all have experiences like that. I certainly remember going to see Oasis and feeling something very similar to that. Can I come to my my fellow editor and partner, Liz Mosley, who, as well as being in charge of the whole thinking strand of Tortoise, is self-described as being in charge of the 90s.
I am, yeah. I wasn't at the time. I've only latterly become in charge of the 90s.
Retrospectively,
yeah.
Sort of curator of the 90s.
Yeah.
Well, it's very, very good of you to come. But you did mention in the chat that, you know, it is I think, and it's always important when one's assessing a sort of decade or a time, not to you know, look with too much rose-tinted spectacles. But it was also, it could be a time of solitude.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I can't disassociate the 90s as I remember it from the person I was. So I was 14 to 24. Those are the ages I was. And in that decade, if you think about it, everything happens in your life. I've got a bit of A-levels. I think that was the low point, really, fashion-wise, at the beginning. And then there's the university era. I had my sort of mod phase. I was thin and cool-ish. And then I got my first job and I moved to Edinburgh. And then by the end of the 90s, I was living in London and sort of somehow making a go of it at a fashion magazine of all things. And it was definitely a simpler time, but then I was a simpler person somehow. Like, stuff hadn't really badly gone wrong until 97 when my mum died, selfishly, I think. And she stubbornly remained dead since that time, which is irritating for everyone.
Continue to be so.
Continue to be so. And so that obviously, in terms of life-defining moments, that is one. And so there's a sort of pre-97 and a post-97 way of thinking about it. I think it's hard to, I feel guilty. I hear myself as a 44-year-old old person talking about the 90s. And I just think, you know, to people in my team and that I work with and that I know, and I just think, you're just being a dick about this. Because it probably wasn't that great. You know that you were lonely, worried, compromised in loads of ways. Even though you were also, you know, dancing to Oasis and having loads of fun in pubs in Camden, these things can exist at the same time. It's very difficult to access the truth of that time. Although, as a young person graduating from university, I was definitely sure that everything was going to be okay. One way or another. You know, I was probably going to get a job. It might be a bit shit to begin with, but I didn't worry about not being able to have a flat. I didn't worry about sort of having a life. And so from that perspective, I do feel a bit of guilt about that, because I think I sort of launched into the world kind of in the knowledge that it was going to be fine. I think
that kind of hits the nail on the head, Liz, which is, it's kind of interesting that that's exactly what I think about the 90s too, which is that it was possibly the last decade when people, you know, probably foolhardily took for granted that there was a kind of trajectory of optimism, and, you know, you'd eventually find somewhere to live and get a career and probably be better off or more content than your parents. And I suspect that was the last decade in which that was the general assumption, and that in that respect, young people do have a harder time now than was the case in the 90s.
I think that's true. I do think, though, that perhaps in some places, depending on where you grow up now, I do think it is more possible to be different, perhaps, than it was in the 90s. So it wasn't a very forgiving era, I wouldn't say, for very young people, you know, 14 to 24 and growing up. I don't think it was particularly forgiving. I think it was pretty brutal. You know, there was the rule, maybe they still do this, I don't know, it's years since I've been in a club, but they used to pick people out of the club queues if you didn't look right, and that was just part of the game, and you kind of accepted it. You know, there were very strict and stringent ways of behaving. I think lad and ladette culture was horrendous, and yet we all just kind of got on with it, even though it was frightening a lot of the time. So there was lots of things about it that were very restrictive and unpleasant, actually. But that is not to say that economically, at least, you kind of felt like if you put in the graft, you'd be okay one way or another.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Liz. Can I come back to Sarah now? Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested, Sarah, in, you know, they were right in the spotlight. And I mean, to Liz's point, one of the things about the 90s that I think is slightly airbrushed now is it was a seriously patriarchal decade. You know, it was quite a boys' decade. It was the time of the lad mags. The general culture was quite laddish, hence the sport. And there was, you know, as Liz mentioned, you know, there was the this idea that women should be ladettes. You know, that the way to gain acceptance was, you know, to be out on the tiles with Chris Evans and Gazza and Ulrika Johnson and Sarah Cox and so on. I mean, how, you know, as a woman, as a performer, how did the gender aspects of it work for you in that decade?
Well, as far as the ladette culture was concerned, you kind of had to go along with it. Otherwise, you just looked like you were a bit of a spoil sport, really. And it didn't sit very well with me. And I just wish I'd have been a bit stronger and just had no time for it. You know, Sarah Cracknell didn't play the game, and neither did Beth from Portishead, and I really admired them for not. But I kind of felt that I kind of had to. I've never wanted to be a party pooper. And yeah, so I ended up kind of going along with it, but it made me feel very, very uncomfortable.
And this was just basically keeping up with the men in terms of pints and
yeah,
and
talking very loudly about sex and things. You know, if you didn't talk very loudly about your sex life, then you were kind of a bit of a spoil sport, really. And I was never particularly comfortable with that. I like a bit of romance, you know.
Yeah.
I think all the romance had kind of gone. And to be accepted, you had to pretend to be a man. You had to do it. A woman had to be a woman on a man's terms rather than a woman being accepted as a woman within herself and on her own terms. And I also feel that the female-fronted bands, as they were called, were pitted against each other and for entertainment, and they were completely the sideshow to the sort of male event, as it were.
And so it was really, I mean, it's interesting because there was at the time, I remember it being sold as a sort of faux feminism almost, you know, that this was which women were establishing themselves on an equal footing, you know, as DJs and entertainment and pop and other forms. But what I'm hearing from you is that it was actually, it was equality, but only by mimicking and going along with the male game.
Absolutely. We had to, they set the rules, they invited us in, and we were their entertainment, really.
So in that respect, it's a happier time now? Yeah,
I mean, I think for me, at the time, I was a lot more uncomfortable in myself. So as you kind of get older and hopefully a little bit wiser, and also you just kind of have this distance these days. In the 90s, you know, it was all focused on who was on the A-list, who was on the front cover of the NME and the Melody Maker, and it was absolute life and death, you know. Whereas now, you know, there are other things. You know, the music is passion. It's, you know, we're completely focused on it. But, you know, there's a pandemic going on. We've got families, you know, we've got, you know, other things that are life and death is kind of life and death rather than, you know.
The stakes are serious.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if my brilliant colleague Nimo Homer is around, having just Nimo, hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Now I'm intrigued as our sort of judge and jury for tonight, really, because you know, what do you make of all this 90s stuff? I mean, I see you're binging Sex and the City.
Yeah.
Does it seem like, which I think was pointed out in the chat, sort of creeps in because it came in 98.
Yeah.
Does that world just seem like a million billion years ago? You know, a lost world of weirdness, or what?
Yeah, I mean, 2019 seems like a lost world to me. So I think the 90s seems like, God, parallel universe. But I mean, I regularly like binge watch Sex and the City. Like I do it every every year or so. And I love it. I mean, I think that there is something that that I just sit around and I cringe at like large parts of the show. And I am like, wow, that's just like not okay. Or like that, I can't believe that is, not I can't believe, but like, wow, that was I can't believe how much things have changed. And I think that it does seem like a million years ago in some respects. And I was born right at the end, 99, just like, you know, managed to get in. But I definitely, it feels like, but I have an older brother and sister who like grew up in the 90s. And
right.
It feels like I kind of grew up on it via them. There was this huge like 90s nostalgia that happened in the early 2010s, that like when they were in their late teens / early 20s, and I really like fed into a lot of like 90s culture, if you like, so to speak, whether that was like, you know, the rap and all that kind of stuff that was going on in the East Coast. But I was like 20 years late to everything, and I was also 10 years old, but it's like a weird para nostalgia that I feel sometimes of a decade that I never experienced or lived in.
Sure.
But it's like a false sense of security that I feel like I've never known. It's interesting.
What do you make of the music? Does it seem just horrendously dated, or does some of it still last?
I think it lasts. I mean, I don't know. I feel like it depends on, so I think that some of the stuff that I was listening to when I was younger, that was like, I listened to quite a lot of like the gangster rap and all that kind of stuff, but also like Oasis, like everyone was talking about and everything. And I was just like, it, in some ways, as I got older, and I like, there was at one point where I thought, this is everything, you know, this is the only music that I want to listen to ever. But I think as I got older, it did start to feel a little bit like, no, there are new things. There are like, and I think that the shininess of the 90s, of this time when everything was okay, started to kind of crumble in front of my eyes a little bit. But the music absolutely holds up. I will always bop to Oasis. That will never stop.
Well, long may you bop. I thoroughly approve, and it's very interesting to me that Oasis seem to me to be the band people have mentioned as one that's endured, which I would not necessarily have expected. Chris, just to come back to you, I mean, do you think was there a moment when you felt that that this particular, I mean, obviously you've continued as you know, very productive, you know, awesome musicians, but that particular aspect, that particular side of things, that moment was passing. Was there a time when you thought, you know, in the way of things, this is just coming to its end?
In terms of the 1990s, the sort
of the
90s
and what it encapsulated.
Sadly, I mean, I think it does sort of coincide with the political element colliding with the artistic element. I mean, I remember being at the Brit Awards in 1996, and like, so we're still in the middle with Sarah, you know, and I'd seen Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell wandering around, and but I didn't realize that it was about to just collide like that until Noel was on stage and said, you know, there's 7 people in the room who are providing hope for the youth of the country at the minute, and it's me, our kid, the members of Oasis, Alan McGee, and Tony Blair. You know, and at that moment I hadn't seen, you know, anybody tying their masks, you know, their colours to the mast that obviously, not, and which was no problem for me, because I wanted Tony Blair to get in for sure. You know, at that point in the 90s, you know, at our age group, we couldn't remember a time before the conservatives. It felt interminable, you know. So you had this huge amount of optimism.
It was interminable. I mean, it was 18.
It felt relentless. So when 97 came and Blair got in, it really did feel very, very exciting. But it almost like that was the peak, and then it started to drift off. And by that, I don't mean drift off to the point where Tony's leading us on a merry dance around the Middle East, the destabilizing countries in the noughties. I mean the whole sort of optimism kind of peaked, and then it was like, okay. And then, you know, and then the bands that came after that, you know, some of them were great. You know, you had like, you know, your Radiohead had their big OK Computer moment. You know, you had Travis came along and stuff, but these were the bands which would lead to Coldplay, you know, and which is, you know, it's fine, but it was no longer about. No, but it was no. You know what I mean? You didn't feel like you were. It was like, whoa. It was just okay, and then it just sort of tailed off. So I guess that was kind of when I knew it was over. But I mean, it wasn't over. It just it hadn't really come to much other than, hey, here we are, and then okay. Do you know what I mean?
Let's go back to Robin. What do you think the you know, the enduring legacy of the 90s is? You know, what bits of it without being sentimental, I guess, what bits of it are, or with being sentimental, which bits of it are still there to be relished and enjoyed?
Things like, I mean, I can remember when I started working, no one would ever, you'd get tickets for Glastonbury and no one would want to go because it was this muddy field with hippies and, in the middle of nowhere. And that changed in the 90s. And obviously now, culturally, we think of that as being a part of the backbone of our culture now. I think that's an enduring thing. There was a point, I think it was 94, when I think Oasis, the Manics, Saint Etienne, the Beastie Boys all played. It was the first time it was televised on Channel 4, before the Beeb took it years later. But I think that was a shift. That became, and then obviously the things that tumble on from that. Other than, I mean, I don't even think people drink excessively like they did then now. I can't really, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's funny because lots of the things dissipated, the dance music scene, which was kind of where I was grounded in, that mutated so much and carries on doing so. I mean, it's very good at kind of renewing itself, and each generation then does what they want with it, and so the idea of, big kind of ravey gigs by bands, they all look different, feel really different now. Some things, a band like the Chems can still draw an audience across the ages. But yeah, in terms of enduring things, I think it's probably the way that festival culture grew at that point. Reading was there, which was still very, even though it had become like an indie version, it was a rock festival up until 89, and then it became, New Order and then Nirvana in 92. And but that still felt, it still felt quite like bottles of piss and things. Whereas, I think Glastonbury and all of the culture around it grew up in that point. Somebody could shout me down on that, but I remember it going from, you'd have 20 tickets that no one wanted because, Primal Scream and, were playing, and there was just a wad of tickets in the office, to it being absolute gold dust. And that was, and I think the last year, the Chems headlined in 2000, which was the last year before the fence went up, and they reckoned that, that was always said to be the biggest crowd that they'd ever had on site, because there was, 100,000 people had busted into the thing. So legally, they've never managed to get, I think Dolly Parton might have broken it actually. But that was, up until that point, it was the biggest. So, the growth of festivals was so huge in that period. But I can't think what other enduring legacies are.
Well, they don't.
Listening to Robin talk, though, has made me realise actually what the moment was when the 90s kind of ended. I mean, we were playing at Reading. We actually had a headlining slot on the Saturday in 1996 in Reading, and whilst we were there, the festival organisers said to us, whilst you're here, you should, have a look around the site, check out the internet tent, right? So we went in there, there's like an empty tent, which was huge. You've got like 3 or 4 different computer screens, and you were invited to go up and have a chug on the keys. And then I kind of if you told me that the content of that tent was actually going to lead to the complete, they'll bring the industry I was into its knees, but within about 4 years, I never would have known that. But that was quite astonishing, really. I just went up back to the festival and forgot all about it.
Somebody would have paid a huge amount of money to have had that tent in there as well. Mr. Internet, whoever he was, would have paid.
Exactly. So I guess that was maybe the moment when the 90s ended.
Definitely.
The day the music died. But we've just got time to go to Nicola Stannard, because Nicola, you made a very good point, which I realised was sorely missing from my list of great things about the decade, which was the comedy, and in particular the Fast Show.
Oh yes.
Now, tell us about what the Fast Show meant to you and why it was important.
I think partly it was sketch shows, so I lighted on the Fast Show but it was a really good decade for the sketch show format, and I mean some brilliant performers, but the one-liners, the way in which every sketch was predictable in a totally good way,
Yeah.
And and at that stage, my boys were, I was actually just having to work it out on a calculator because my mental maths is so bad at the moment. They were kind of 11, 12, 13. So it was something we could enjoy. It had a sort of political edge to it, but it was just funny. So that was my view of Fast Show, but it was part of that same thing. The other thing I was looking up, which only just made the cut, which was 1999, I discovered, was League of Gentlemen.
Yeah,
and by the time the boys were that bit older, League of Gentlemen was just like, cancel all social engagements, because
absolutely.
Anyway, so that was my point.
And Liz is pointing out quite rightly the day-to-day, which was magnificent,
yes.
and has yet to be improved upon. And I it's interesting about sketch comedy because it really hasn't, apart from Mitchell and Webb, it really hasn't made a return in the years since. Let me sort of close by going back, if I may, to our three guests, just for some final observations. You've given us so much, but thoughts about, capsule thoughts about what we might take away from the evening and how we might reflect upon the 90s. Maybe if you could go, Chris, if you could go first.
Crumbs, what to take away from it? Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, I look back at it in a time of, genuine optimism and lots of possibilities, which didn't, I think we've covered the things which didn't turn out as well as we might have liked. But I mean, there's still, you have to retain that sort of, that attitude as much as you possibly can. I mean, in a year where we've been under house arrest for 12 months effectively, it's very difficult to make a comparison when we're talking about how does the 90s compare to now. It just doesn't, I mean, looking back, it's amazing we were allowed to smoke at the bar, let alone get into one. Do you know what I mean? So,
Not a bad memory. Sarah, fond memories or just one of those decades that pass?
Oh, it's so difficult because I think I was quite unhappy in myself, but I was thrown into this unbelievably exciting time. So that was quite hard to reconcile. All my dreams had come true and yet I still wasn't happy. It's just like, oh gosh, so that was quite hard to reconcile. But looking back, I've got some fantastic experiences, some really great memories. Yeah.
And Robin?
I think there was, I think if you go back, there are some phenomenal records that are kind of slightly off-piste. Even the big records there. I spent the weekend listening to Spiritualized, Ladies and Gentlemen, and it's like, I think that there's the 90s is peppered with records like that aren't part of they're not part of the dialogue. They're not part of the Britpop dialogue that we keep hearing and keep coming back to. Just records that they're timeless, which is why they don't feel like the 90s probably. And I think in terms of music, it was a time when you were getting people, there was a lot of people who were properly at the top of their game, people who've had long careers, but that is their point. I'd dig deeper.
It's very interesting. Thank you all very much. We're running out. We have run out of time, in fact. So I fear I must wind up very quickly. But what I'm left with is that there is something real and worth preserving in our memories and our hearts about the 90s. The big discovery for me which really surprised me, was that Oasis remained popular, at least with a certain demographic of young male, because I had assumed as a centrist dad that they were now the preserve of centrist dad. So it's an interesting an enlightening discovery to learn from them that they're not. I think looking back on the 90s, what why did it end? What did we lose? There was something changed with 9/11 and social media that ended that sense of glorious collective experience. And that although there were downsides, particularly in terms of gender during the decade, there was nonetheless a sense of some sort of shared experience that is always worth trying to recover. In the chat, you will have seen the mighty Mark having put forward the playlist we've been curating. Do download that. It's a lot of fun, and there are some extraordinary items on it, including are they vaccine deniers or lockdown skeptics? I forget. Right, said Fred. So it's got something for everyone. That's probably the most polite way of saying it. Thank you to Santander for supporting us. Thank you very, very much to Sarah, Chris, and Robin for being such fantastic speakers. But for now, thank you all. Have a great evening.